Nancy Pearcey's new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, was not what I thought it was going to be. Let me tell you what I mean.
Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz.
Okay, I have here Nancy Pearcey's new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, from Baker Books. Thank you to Baker for sending me a review copy of this. Okay, I'm going to take you through my typical format of my main idea, the research, the readability, and my reaction to this book. Okay, so I hinted to this in the little stinger at the beginning, but this was not what I thought it was going to be. I admit I had some expectations coming into this, and I'll unpack a little bit of what my expectations were and how this did not really line up with those as we go through the review. But just know that's kind of the overarching theme of this review. The main idea of the toxic war on masculinity, I'm going to say this in three sections because the book really is composed of three pretty discrete parts, I would say. And the bulk of it's the middle one, which I'll spend the most time on. But okay, so the whole book is about gender relations in our culture, ostensibly, but the first section of the book is kind of a section on data, and so she pulls on a few really interesting studies to try to complicate some of the narratives we have about toxic masculinity or toxic men in our culture. And the upshot of that first section is that she tries to draw, and I think pretty well, she persuasively draws a distinction in this data that exists, these studies that exist. There's a distinction between men who claim the term evangelical and are actually involved in an evangelical church community, and men who claim the term evangelical but actually are not meaningfully involved or are effectively not really Christians in any practical sense. And what she argues from the data, as the data bears out, is that there's really crucial differences in the behaviors of those two kind of subgroups of men, and that the men who are involved, measurably involved in evangelical communities, are actually significantly lower on all of the traits we would associate with toxic masculinity, things like violence or emotional abuse in the home, things like divorce rates, things like extramarital affairs rates, all that stuff. They're much lower than the average man in our culture, whereas the men who claim the term evangelical but are not functionally Christian or evangelical, not involved in church community, don't actually hold to the beliefs, yet claim the term, they're much higher than the average on all of those metrics in terms of those behaviors that can be measured and reported. So her argument in that first section of the book is that, unfortunately, those two subgroups get conflated under the term Christian or evangelical, and so the result comes out that there's no discernible difference between Christian, in the narrative, there's no discernible difference between Christian men and the average man when it comes to toxic behaviors or abusive behaviors. And she's really trying to complicate that in that very first section of the book, is to say, and she's coming at this from an unashamed Christian apologist kind of perspective, is to say that, hey, maybe there is something about Christianity that is actually like good for male behavior when you actually break apart the data in that way. So that's the first section of the book. It's kind of an exploration of some studies and some data. The second section of the book, I'm going to try to move through this more quickly to keep this from going too long. The second section of the book is the bulk of her book, and it's an historical argument. And maybe I'll talk more about this in my reaction section, but it's an historical argument tracing kind of narratives about gender and the way gender is performed, or how gender roles have been delineated and described and defined in Western culture. She traces an historical argument from essentially pre-industrial revolution in a more agrarian, agriculturally based economy through the Industrial Revolution to modern day. And her historical argument is that the development of the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, everything that comes along, manufacturing and factories and all the things that come along with that's very significant cultural change, had trickle-down effects on how men function in society and in the family unit, and also for women, how they function, particularly in the family unit. And that her argument as an historical argument is essentially that a lot of what we see as tension between the genders, tension between men and women, tension between the roles of men and women, are kind of all flow out of that really significant cultural, technological shift all around the Industrial Revolution. That's the majority of her book, is an historical argument. That's one way. I mentioned that this book surprised me. That's one way in that this book surprised me, in that it's actually primarily an historical argument. I was not expecting that when I opened it. Okay, and then the third section is where she moves into a little bit more of a discussion of where then do we go from here? Like, what are some forward-looking proposals for how we might ease the tension in our culture, ease the tension between men and women, broadly speaking. Those are the three sections: the data, the historical argument, and then kind of a forward-looking proposals. That's the makeup of the book. Okay, I couldn't summarize that in one main idea because they're really three very different sections, so I really wanted to break those apart and give you a sense of what's actually in the book. Okay. I'll move more quickly through these next couple sections. So the research behind it is it varies on the three sections. So the first section, she pulls primarily on some data, some very recent data. It's a good discussion of the data. I thought it made sense. My only question is that it seemed like maybe a somewhat limited data set, but I am not a data expert, a statistician by any means, so all I can say is that it seems like she very fairly represented some very good studies that do seem very rigorous and academic and careful, and she makes very, I think, clear and sensible interpretations of that data in that section. Okay, the historical argument is a much bigger swing in terms of the research, and she's read a lot. She is a very, very well-read person. She reminds me a bit of a Francis Schaeffer type evangelical intellectual, which actually isn't surprising if you know her story. She was deeply influenced by Labrie and Francis Schaeffer. But what I mean by that is that or maybe a Mark Sayers type, if you're familiar with who Mark Sayers is. What I mean by this is that she is very good at synthesizing a lot of big ideas and popularizing them. So she's not... And I want to say this very carefully because I don't mean this in any way as a slight or an insult. She's not an academic in the sense of a deep fluency and mastery of a narrow subject. I love reading academics who have these like really deep masteries of, for example, a really particular historical era or something. She's not that. She's much more of a widely read person who can pull and synthesize a lot of books in particular into kind of an understandable argument. And again, Francis Schaeffer was really good at that. Mark Sayers, I think, is very good at that. The trade-off there is that you get a pretty wide synthesis without necessarily any super deep dives into more specific eras. So she moves through a pretty wide swath of history going from pre-industrial revolution up to modern day. And she's very well read. She's really read a lot of books that summarize these different historical eras and make pretty good arguments about it. But she's not as conversant in maybe the deep historical academic arguments. So all of that really matters for the purpose of kind of understanding this book, I think. So like I was reading this, and she makes a couple arguments about secularization, for example, which is a subject I'm decently well read on. And so she talks about the advent of secularization in modernity. And there's a lot of people. She doesn't talk about Charles Taylor. I just finished Joseph Minich's new book. She doesn't really interact with that. And there are a few moments when she makes pretty broad statements about like the split between sacred and secular. And there were a few moments where I was like, yeah, that's one way to understand it, but it's not the only way. And the way that she synthesizes it and puts it forward is so it's as though you can read that and think, oh, well, that must be the only way to understand this. But it's just not the case because it's not that super deep dive. Now, all I'm really trying to say there is that she's a very good, widely read person and very good at fairly synthesizing what she's widely read, but it is not that really deep, rigorous academic approach to research. And that comes particularly clear in the historical section of the book because she moves through such a broad historical argument. Now, that's not to invalidate her argument at all. I actually found a lot of her argument very, very persuasive, but it is a little bit of a limitation by the nature of the book and the type of writing that she's engaging in. There were a couple times where there were wrinkles where I was like, yeah, there's other ways to really get at this. That's not all that's happening in the advent of secularization, for example. It's not only about industrialization and then the kind of the urbanization, although that's part of it. So that's some of the research. Really well read. Fairly represents it, but it's much more of a kind of popularizing, synthesizing argument as opposed to a deep mastery of a single kind of slice. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and then finally, so it's a bit on the research, my reaction. This has already gone a little bit longer. There's a lot in this book, and it's a very important topic, and so that's part of why maybe this review is going a little longer than I typically do. Okay, my reaction to this. Let me loop back to what I said at the very beginning, which was this was not what I expected. So a couple things I want to say. First of all, I think that the blurbs and endorsements on the back of this book are a little unfortunate in the sense that if you just read those names, you might be tempted to automatically relegate this to a right-wing culture war type text. I think that's really unfortunate. And I'm avoiding saying names. You can look up who endorsed the book, and you'll probably know what I mean as soon as you see some of those names. That's really important to say because I had a little bit of an allergic reaction to some of that feeling when I saw that this book was being endorsed by this list of people. However, I know Nancy Pearcey to be a thoughtful person, and I appreciated her previous book, Love Thy Body, which I also reviewed on this channel a while ago. So I pushed through that. And I would say if you're at all like me and you have the similar reaction to kind of anything that smacks of like right-wing quasi-culture war, fundamentalistic Christian argumentation, if you're like me at all, then know that this book is not fairly represented by kind of that flavor of kind of culture engagement. It's just not. This is a thoughtful, careful book, and she is not engaging in. I would actually say this book is significantly less polemic in its tone than even Love Thy Body was, which I didn't even think was that argumentative or combative. So just know that like, this is an argument that deserves to be thought about and read and considered carefully. So that's one way in which it wasn't what I expected it to be. I didn't expect it to be a discussion of data. Like I already talked about that. I thought that was a pleasant surprise. I thought it was really interesting and really helpful to read her interpretation of these studies that I probably need to be a little bit more widely known about. I didn't expect it to be primarily historical in argument. I did not expect it to be essentially a historical cultural study of the shifts in broad culture, but specifically shifting landscape around gender and gender roles moving through the Industrial Revolution. And I have to say that her argument, when I realized what she was doing in that, I thought, this is helpful. It actually didn't surprise me because she's far from the only person who's made these arguments that the shift towards more urban centers and husbands being out of the home, day in and day out, has had a deleterious effect on the relationship between husband and wife, and then vice versa by relegating the wife to just being in the home and having kind of no economic partnership with the man. She's not the only person making that argument, but I think she does it in a very fair, thoughtful, well-read, fresh way, and does it in a way that is relevant and salient to kind of what is happening in our attitudes toward the tension between men and women, broadly speaking, in our culture today. I just didn't expect her to take that angle. I thought this would be more of a discussion of the feminist movement. I thought that she would be talking a lot more about feminist literature and feminist books and feminist writing. There's a tiny bit of that in there, but it's really not. It's really a lot more about that history. I also thought it would be a lot more explicitly theological in scope, where the subtitle is How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And it's actually, there is definitely some of that. Like she talks about, she theorizes as to why it is that these evangelical men who are actually deeply immersed and involved in evangelical communities might have better behavior. But it's not primarily trying to make some sort of theological apologetic argument. It really is a lot more about that historical tracing that she's doing. So these were all surprises to me, and for the most part, they were pleasant surprises. I love reading about history, and I think that she does a good job at synthesizing a pretty interesting historical argument when it comes to what actually has shifted culturally around our notions of what men and women do, and especially and it's essentially a pretty conservative argument in the sense that she is arguing for some kind of intentional, not winding back the clock or going backwards per se, but she is trying to argue for a recovery of a whole kind of family unit mentality and a cooperation between the man and the husband and the wife, in this case, the man and the woman. And she does presume, I mean, she's coming from a very conservative traditional Christian perspective, so she presumes it would not be a same-sex couple. She presumes it would be a man and a woman, husband and wife, family unit. And it's deeply conservative in the sense that she's kind of trying to retrieve what was, in her view, good about the notion of the man and the woman being partners economically and in terms of child rearing and in terms of just kind of developing the spirituality of the family. She's really arguing for kind of revisiting and trying to return to that approach and that mindset of the cooperation between the genders, which is really interesting, especially if you've done the work to read through her tracing of what changed and shifted across the advent of the Industrial Revolution. That's a lot of really the thrust of this book, which was, again, a surprise to me. I didn't expect that. I expected a little bit more polemics about feminist rhetoric, for example. I expected some more polemics about some like critical theory or Marxism or something. I expected a little bit more of that, and it's just not what the Toxic War on Masculinity is about. Now, I will say, I want to end on a few more comments, particularly on that last section, the third section of the book, when she moves into some proposals. In her attempt to encourage some imagination or some creative thinking about how to recover the family unit mindset, she does encourage some thinking about stuff like remote working, things like how do we kind of circumscribe our career aspirations, particularly if you're a really career driven person. How do you accept some limitations on that for the sake of your family? How do you think about the life of your family, especially when you have young kids, as kind of a season in which you might need to sacrifice things for your career for the good of your family? I liked all of this stuff. I thought it was great. I do wonder if it's a little bit socioeconomically limiting. I think there are wide swaths of socioeconomic classes that probably can't consider those kinds of what could come across as like fairly privileged ideas, fairly privileged choices to make, like remote working and stuff. So take that critique for what it's worth. I think it was something that I was considering as I was reading through it. I'll also say about that final section of the book that she takes the narratives of abuse when it comes to children and wives in particular, because this is a book about masculinity. She takes narratives about that stuff extraordinarily seriously, which is worth mentioning, I think, because what I said earlier about this potentially being branded or labeled as kind of a little bit of a right-wing culture war text. This stands out and pushes back on a lot of what comes across that otherwise would come across that way in her very, very compassionate validation of a lot of those accounts of abuse, and she uses that to say we need to like really take this stuff seriously. We need, especially in the world of evangelical church, we need to like really take rampant abuse seriously, abuse at the hands of men, of husbands in particular, and rethink how do we rethink and encourage people to think about their cooperation in their responsibility. Responsibility is a big theme. Responsibility in the kind of healthy family unit, building up of a healthy family unit. How do we take that all more seriously? How do we take especially allegations of abuse and narratives of abuse extraordinarily seriously? So I found that quite refreshing. But again, I was surprised by that. I just didn't expect the book to kind of go in that direction. So what you have here in Nancy Pearcey's new book is a really interesting discussion of data, a really interesting, I think fairly captured historical argument that has some maybe potentially blind spots, like I talked about, but is nevertheless a good wide synthesis of some good historical argumentation, and then a few chapters which may be potentially the weakest section of the book, all told, of some like where do we go from here discussion. But it is at heart a very conservative book, very conservative argument, but it's one that is thoughtful, well-reasoned, not polemic in nature, not combative, not reactionary at all. I'm honestly really glad I read this. I think she makes some important points that need to be considered alongside a little bit of more of a progressive interpretation of some of these same issues that are at play. And it's 100% not a screed or a right-wing culture war Molotov cocktail. It's not that at all. It's a book that I think is important for our time, and important particularly if you would consider yourself someone on the more anyone should read it, but I was going to say if you consider yourself more on the left or progressive end of things, wrestling with what she's trying to say here, I think is extremely edifying, extremely valuable. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on a little bit of a longer review than I typically do, but this one was worth a little bit of careful unpacking. But those are my thoughts on The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy Pearcey. Thank you again to Baker for sending this to me, for putting this out there, putting out a thoughtful book. If anything like that I just talked about sounds of interest to you, I would love to hear what you think about this book after you get a chance to get your hands on it. Thanks, as always, for watching.